All of this, of course, ahead of today's meeting between President Ramaphosa and President Trump. Gustavo Carvalho is a senior researcher at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Spector is a former US diplomat and an associate editor at Daily Maverick. Gentlemen, good afternoon to you and good morning to you, and thank you for your time. Gustavo, if I may start with you, I've been trying to think of a meeting involving a South African president that's got as high a profile. There's this one. I remember George W. Bush coming to South Africa. I remember the BRICS summit being held here just sort of 18 months ago. This seems to overshadow all of those events. That really does tell us something, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think to a large degree is a response to the style that we've been seeing from Washington for the last couple of months. There is a certain degree of theatrics that we see coming out of the White House in the current administration, and it was important for South Africa to somehow match that level. Of course, the big question here is not simply about what profile the meetings will have and the delegations that is there, but really will the South African government be able to actually reset those relations as mentioned by President Ramaphosa, and as we recently heard in your broadcast now from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But certainly does provide a sense that it is an important relations. There is imperative from South Africa to engage with the US in a different way. And hopefully that will be able to provide at least the start of a new type of engagement that seemingly will be much more focused on more transactional issues, trade issues, and benefits for the US and benefits for South Africa, and how much the Ramaphosa will be able to shoot some of the more difficult questions and difficult issues, particularly in relation to the South Africa long-standing position on Palestine, but also its bilateral relations with other countries, including China.
Brooks, one of the things I don't quite understand is we've seen the Trump administration spending most of the time over the last few months attacking South Africa. We see Marco Rubio now confirming they won't come to the G20 just because they don't like what we stand for. And yet, despite that, Trump issues an invitation for Ramaphosa to come to the White House. What can we read into that?
Good morning, Steve. I would break down the question that there are three layers of the relationship. I mean, there is the performative version of things, and you heard Marco Rubio giving that kind of dance. There are peripheral issues relative to the bilateral relationship, at least, and that, for example, includes the International Court of Justice question and the relationship with Iran. Both countries, the U.S. and South Africa, are engaging with Iran in various kinds of ways now, which is different than might have been true 6, 8, 10 months ago. But then there are core issues, and those are things like trade and investment and participation in larger multilateral issues. And the task for Cyril Ramaphosa is to diminish the performative questions, marginalize to some degree those things that are effectively marginal to the bilateral framework, and focus intently on the core issues, almost regardless of what other people might be saying. And you can sort of posit, on the one side is the Trump-Zelensky fiasco, which was all about performance, or the Keir Starmer and the Mark Carney versions of the meetings with Trump, which were much closer to core issue concerns. Ramaphosa, if he's good at doing this, and I think actually he has a good shot at it, focusing much more on the core and agreeing to disagree on some of the other things. And if he can get that far, then you can chalk this one down as a successful approach, because it's important for this country to get that right.
Brooks, I mean, I have to agree with you that is important. And I mean, I think that is absolutely what Ramaphosa wants to do. But Gustavo, let me come at this question in a slightly different way, because you used the phrase spectacle, and I think that does define the Trump administration, the way things are going to some way. But the Trump administration and Trump's campaign has largely been about race in the United States in lots of different coded forms. And the whole idea of Afrikaner refugees is about that too. Ramaphosa is the very personification of what Trump doesn't like. And I did wonder if Ramaphosa might almost feel that he's carrying perhaps Africa on his shoulders today when he comes face to face with someone who's spent most of his time, frankly, attacking black people.
I think it's an important question, and essentially it's going to feature within that. I think for me, fundamentally, what will drive that debate, both in terms of the working lunch they're going to have and then the public meeting that is going to be held immediately after, relates to how much Ramaphosa will be able to utilize and present what cards South Africa is holding. And I think if we use an analogy to the embarrassing meeting that occurred between Zelensky and Trump earlier this year in the Oval Office, I think there are fundamental issues that are very much to the core of what this administration is looking at in the United States in terms of critical minerals that South Africa possess, American investments, and so on. Will they be enough to swing a weight into one side or another? It's still uncertain, but what it does provide is that there are points of bargaining capacity that South Africa has at the moment, and it's certainly become quite symbolic for many countries within the Global South, considering that this is the highest level meeting from a Global South country that is perhaps in a much trickier position with the United States that we've seen since the beginning of the Trump administration. But also, I think, very much on the style of Trump and the style of the administration is what types of concessions South Africa will be able to present that will give a sense to the United States that there is a winning in that, and how much those concessions will be done balancing out domestic public opinion that would not like to see Ramaphosa presenting a subservient position. And that fine balance for me, more than the Afrikaner issue, and perhaps not so much in terms of the Palestine issue, because I have a feeling that there is going to be mentions about that, but not really a great degree of engagement. I think, and Brooks was mentioning some of the meetings that occurred between Trump and other global leaders. The best case scenario, I think, for South Africa now would be a meeting to the likes of the one that President Trump had recently with Mark Carney from Canada, where Carney presented very firmly some of the positions that Canada had in terms of the bilateral relations, and primarily lets Trump talk and present his own narratives and views. That, to a certain degree, reduces that view of South Africa as an antagonist country, and a country that we can actually talk to, even if it means perhaps listening to a few things that Ramaphosa may not be pleased with. And I think Ramaphosa has a good degree of experience of dealing with those situations, considering the role that he played with CODESA, but also a really important role he played even before coming into the presidency in terms of steering some of those difficult dialogues.
There's so much to talk about here. I mean, Brooks, everyone's talking about a good meeting, a successful meeting. How do we define success? Is success just where nobody shouts at each other, where no one comes out feeling humiliated? Is success, never mind the performative aspects, the spectacle in the Oval Office later, is it really just what is actually signed on the bottom line? And I mean, it's a funny question sometimes, but how do you define success going into a meeting like this, especially with someone who can change his mind as quickly as Trump?
Well, I mean, success is obviously relative. On the one end of the spectrum is the shouting and the finger pointing and the arm waving and the screaming and then being basically kicked out of the White House. That's you can mark that one down as a failure. But they managed to, even though that happened, that relationship was righted to some degree in the succeeding weeks. A success at the optimum, score 10 on the success scale. There's a joint communique that the two parties agree that the following things are crucial. The other things are less important. We agree to disagree on A, B, and C, and we look forward to progressively improving the relationship. That would be a 10. I think you're going to end up with somewhere around 6 or 7 by the time this is over, because you're not going to get a joint communique in my suspicions. What you will have, though, is a televised version of things, at least in part, where the two men are, if not amicably talking about things as adults, because Ramaphosa has done a very interesting thing. He has taken as part of his delegation a white cabinet member, John Steenhuisen, and 2 golfers. And we all know that Donald Trump is an absolute fiend for golfing. And I gather Ramaphosa doesn't mind an occasional swing of the golf clubs either. And they may end up talking rather a lot about golf and using golf as a metaphor for the kind of thing they wish to achieve. Basically, a success will be agreement that American access to South African markets, however way you wish to define this, is made more open, friendlier, and investors are more embraced and welcomed than they already are by either relaxing or adjusting certain kinds of regulatory structures. That's a win. An agreement that other things like improving the trade balance. Remember, South Africa has a positive surplus trade balance with the United States, one of the few countries that South Africa has that kind of trade balance with. Encouraging more American goods imported into South Africa, that will be a win. A footnote to all this, of course, is that this Afrikaner refugee issue is really about American domestic issues. It's about building the support base in the United States for Donald Trump, for his supporters. It really has very little to do with international relations or with bilateral relations, even though it has gotten an extraordinary amount of press play in this country. In the United States, it's become sort of a ho-hum issue. Sure. Moving on. Yeah. And most people you talk to just shrug their shoulders and say, well, all right. And we're talking about, 50 people or so scattered over a vast landscape. Sure. It's not a whole lot.
Okay, Brooks, Gustavo, it's fascinating that there are really important issues on the table. Our differences with the United States over Israel, for example. Starlink is something that is either perhaps dangerous or really a boon to mankind. And yet we're talking about having to include golfers in a delegation. It kind of tells you where we are, just to ease things. I made the point, Gustavo, at the beginning of this conversation that I cannot remember such a high sense of anticipation ahead of a meeting involving a South African president in recent times. And yet, I wonder if this meeting will really matter, because the Trump administration seems to change its mind so quickly on so many issues that almost no matter what happens today, we might actually find that it has no significant bearing over the long term. What do you think?
I think there is much more of a symbolism of this meeting rather than what we tangibly will see in terms of substance. I think Brooks well mentioned that what we should be seeing is certain directions. We shouldn't expect a trade deal to be signed at this stage. Trade deals take considerably longer, and if we see the current experiences from Japan or even from the United Kingdom, these issues are going to take much longer to do. But what we can identify if the meeting is successful is perhaps a direction in which the two countries would like to work together. We see already a number of rumors in terms of creating potential concessions on licensing for Starlinks, creating equity equivalents that would bypass BEE regulations, but also at the same time providing visible social investments. They will talk about critical minerals and particularly the role of platinum within this space, and especially for companies that are developing hybrids, the platinum becomes a particularly important mineral. The question for Ramaphosa and for us will be that will those concrete issues be enough to sway a narrative that has been very much thrown into, as Brooks mentioned, into certain domestic narratives within the United States, and whether this will dominate the views that Trump and perhaps Marco Rubio and others will be presenting within that meeting. I think it is a very tricky rope. I think there are possibilities for successful outcomes for us to see later today, but it's certainly that symbolism of this particular visit. I think it's very important that shows that a much more intentional approach from South Africa on its interactions with the United States that will not necessarily stop disagreeing on issues,
Sure.
but certainly avoid some of those pitfalls that it has fallen in the last couple of years.
Gustavo de Carvalho, thank you. From the Institute of International Affairs, Spector, Associate Editor at Daily Maverick and a former US diplomat.